But we are hoping to have a new date very soon. But we will have our second series in March, so look forward to that. And I will turn it over to Preston to get started.
Thank you. You haven't heard anything yet. Well, it's a pleasure to be back here. I'm going to put on a little pin that I picked up at an antique sale yesterday. More about that a little bit later on. This actually relates to the story today. But you know, they say economics is the dismal science. And while this story isn't really economics, and it really isn't dismal, any of you, and I suspect looking around, probably the vast majority of us in here, have dealt with probate one way or another, somebody's estate, either making plans for your own, or being a legatee of somebody else's, or dealing with attorneys involved in that, somehow involved with estates. You've got some idea that dealing with estates can be at one point very exciting, especially if you're going to receive something, or it can be very depressing, especially if you thought you were going to be receiving something. And that's what Benjamin Franklin's living heirs found out, and then you don't. So that can be kind of a bummer as well. So I want to get right started with this. It's kind of my way of dealing with these, to kind of keep it going by doing it as you would a reading of a paper. So here we go. Late this past November, as the season of giving and last-minute appeals began, I received a letter from a well-known and highly regarded charity with a strong local presence. It began with these words, and I'll read the letter. Everyone should have a will. If you get a knot in your stomach when you hear this, you're not alone. Many people find the subject daunting because they simply have no idea where to begin. I'm writing to you because making a will doesn't have to be stressful. In fact, it's a gift you give yourself. Nearly all of us receive a flood of such requests, and not just during the giving season either. Grudgingly, we have to admit that most of them are necessary. It's just a subject that we dread, if not resent, and largely avoid. You and I are not alone in our mixed feelings about our legacy. We want to do right by our heirs, which is subject to a lot of interpretation, as it was with Franklin. And most of us want to benefit our communities or religious institutions. But how? Echoing in your ears may well be the old adage that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. It may be some small comfort to know that a true icon of American culture, a self-made man who seemingly pulled himself up by his bootstraps to achieve wealth and international status, felt the same emotions. That is the reason that Benjamin Franklin hit upon a unique idea that was incorporated in his last will and testament in the summer of 1788. And that emotional tug of war is the reason for Michael Meyer's latest book about one of our favorite founding fathers. Meyer put it this way in his book's introduction. What could there possibly be left to say about Benjamin Franklin? He appears to be self-evident, as elemental to history as water is to earth. Over the centuries, bookshelves have progressively sagged with titles recounting his remarkable life. Here for a change is the untold story of his inspiring afterlife. Well, I'm here to tell you that Meyer's book is much more than that. At the root of Meyer's story is the basic fact of Ben Franklin's will and its list of bequests. Franklin's total assets at the time of his death were estimated to be a little over 136 pounds. Not a lot of money. That, of course, did not count his real estate holdings, investments, or many debts and payments due to him. Meyer reminds his readers here of a statement by Franklin's own alter ego, Poor Richard. A fat kitchen makes a lean will. At the time of his death, Franklin had very few heirs. They included his adored sister Jane and his daughter Sally Franklin Bache. Franklin had two grandsons. His embarrassing and rejected son William had a son Temple. William had lived a profligate life, been the loyalist governor of New Jersey, imprisoned on his father's orders, and otherwise irritated and betrayed his father's interests. His legacy was largely worthless, consisting of forgiven debts owed to his father. Temple was given his grandfather's library and personal papers, a legacy he tried in turn to make a profit from with very little success in future years. Franklin's living heirs received things, mostly valuable things, scientific instruments, books, bejeweled picture frames, papers, tools, etc. But they received very little cash. Sally's son, Benjamin Franklin Bache, was the apple of Franklin's eye, but his inheritance consisted of Franklin's printing business and tools. He took to printing and publishing as his grandfather had, and later became famous as the publisher of a sensational newspaper, the Aurora, that was a thorn in the sides of many politicians of the time. The first person arrested under the infamous Alien Sedition laws in 1798, John Adams called Benjamin Franklin Bache a malicious libeler. A seemingly small part of Franklin's legacy, yet a large portion of his cash, and therefore the controversial part of his will, were the two bequests of £1,000 each, given to the cities of Boston and Philadelphia. Those two bequests were to fund twin funds to promote the business of working class tradesmen. Small loans were to be made in each city that would run for 10 years. They would be repaid at 5% interest. That loan scheme would run for 100 years. At the end of that time, an assessment of the effectiveness of the loans would be made in each city. If the volunteer trustees judged the program productive, it would be renewed for another 100 years. At the end of 200 years, each city could spend the fund, or what remained of it, on civic improvements or public works. The provisions of Franklin's bequest were carried out, sort of. The last payment was made to the city of Boston in 1994, so it's within our lifetimes. How those provisions were carried out is the seed of Meyer's story. Meyer's telling of Franklin's story is very well documented. Although Meyer is not a professor or professional historian, perhaps that logic goes without saying, it is well written and will hold your attention because Meyer is a journalist and a professor of English at the University of Pittsburgh. And incidentally, he lives in a part of Pittsburgh that I actually know fairly well, known, believe it or not, as Squirrel Hill. There is a 7-page bibliography, a very useful timeline, 32 pages of notes that provide a thorough accounting of just where Meyer got his information and a justification for his opinions. Meyer arranges his coverage of Franklin's last bet in 3 acts, much the way a stage play unfolds. In 4 chapters, Act 1 gives readers the background of Franklin's death and how the events surrounding it had an impact on Franklin's plans for the future of his legacy. We learn about his actual death and how the public reacted to it in the immediate aftermath, as well as in later years, quite differently actually. We learn about his often expressed desire to be useful. There are, in turn, chapters on the foundations of Franklin's fortune, his surviving heirs and how he felt about them, and why Franklin set up his estate scheme in the way that he did. Act 1 provides some interesting insight into both Franklin and his times. Eulogies to Franklin were slow to materialize in America. He had, to the very end of his days, crossed swords, or perhaps quills, with many people on issues as consequential as slavery. Consequently, a large packet of letters, together with an extensive eulogy, was received first from revolutionary France, before American officials had taken any official notice of Franklin's passing. It was addressed to the President and the American Congress. It sat unopened on Washington's desk at Mount Vernon for a while. Washington thought that it possibly violated the principle of separation of powers between the executive and the legislative branches. He ultimately sent the packet to Vice President John Adams, President of the Senate. Adams was also concerned about the implications for separation of powers and sent it back unopened to Washington. His Excellency then sent it to the Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, who finally opened it. Seeing that the cover letter was addressed to Congress, Jefferson sent the packet back to Adams. By this time, Benjamin Franklin had been dead for 8 months. In the meantime, on April 22nd, 1790, the U.S. House of Representatives voted unanimously to wear the customary badge of mourning, a black crepe armband, for 1 month. The Senate voted down a similar resolution, and Washington also decided against it for the executive branch, expressing to Jefferson a reluctance to set a precedent for official government mourning, and perhaps wishing to avoid the ostentation of royal mourning practices in Europe. I proposed to General Washington, Jefferson later wrote to Benjamin Rush, that the executive department should wear mourning. He declined it because, he said, he should not know where to draw the line if he once began that ceremony. With all that in mind, and it does sound ridiculous to us, it tells us a great deal about the founding fathers and presumably mothers, and their desire to avoid, or at least keep at arm's length, the foibles of European monarchy. Meyer goes further, implying that Franklin would have well understood the kerfuffle as part of the chess game of life. Chess is not merely an amusement, Meyer quotes Franklin as saying, "For life is a kind of chess in which we have often points to gain and competitors or adversaries to contend with, and in which there is a vast variety of good and ill events that are in some degree the effects of providence or the want of it. By playing at chess then, we may learn foresight, which looks a little into futurity and considers the consequences that may attend an action." The final chapter of Act 1 walks the reader through Franklin's strategy for the chess game that he envisioned after his life was over. Act 2 consists of 5 chapters. It is an exposition of how Franklin's plans for his legacy, that great game of chess, actually worked out between 1791 and 1904. Meyer recounts, in turn, the machinations of the volunteer trustees of Franklin's Legacy Fund. What is particularly interesting is how the goals of the succession of trustees interpreted their responsibilities and how they in turn interpreted Franklin's intentions in ways that supported their assumptions and their intentions. In short, Franklin clearly placed great faith in working-class tradesmen as the embodiment of America's future. His trustees did not, and they systematically avoided lending money to the leather apron boys. In many years, Franklin's fund trustees made no loans at all, bringing Franklin's legacy efforts to a temporary halt. Nevertheless, a succession of volunteer trustees soldiered on in the service of their respective cities. Meyer details their sins of commission and omission in some detail. The 4 chapters of Act 3 bring the reader to a consideration of how Franklin's bet worked out over the 2nd century of its impact. Both Boston and Philadelphia were required to demonstrate that they had handled the funds properly. Otherwise, the residue would return to Franklin's heirs. And those heirs were ready to and did file several lawsuits to recover the funds, this a century after Franklin's death. The details of those suits, the heirs lost incidentally, and the precedents they set are well described in this part of Meyer's book. Collectively, Acts 2 and 3 detail how, over time, Franklin's wager was misused, neglected, and contested, but never wholly extinguished. The eventual success of Franklin's scheme can be seen as a forerunner of microfinance, according to Meyer, author Meyer, and a validation of what Warren Buffett calls the Methuselah technique. Daniel Matz, reviewing Meyer's book and Franklin's wager for Philanthropy News Digest, calls Franklin the first American philanthropist. I'm not sure how that squares with John Harvard back in the 1600s, but if he wasn't the first, certainly one of the first 5, we'll say. He was the first to embrace philanthropy as a private instrument for effecting public good. He goes on to remind potential readers of Meyer's book to carefully consider the facts presented. It is important, Matt says, to recognize that Franklin was not entirely a self-made man, that Deborah Franklin's wealth and family connections were critical to his success. Meyer presents evidence of that and certainly does present an image of Deborah Franklin that is much different from other biographies of Ben. Franklin's legacy bet, while often cloudy and sometimes convoluted, does have a happy ending. However, it is not as happy an ending as Franklin would have wanted it to be. In part, that is due to circumstances Franklin could not foresee. The impact of the Second Industrial Revolution, the long decline of the apprentice system, and the decline of public-spirited volunteerism in the 19th century were all factors in tempering the impact of Franklin's financial legacy. And it must be said as well that over time, some of the decisions made by a succession of volunteer trustees, while clearly counter to Franklin's wishes, were necessary to preserve the fund and accomplish what was possible. Just an example of that. Franklin wanted to stake small, single proprietor businesses, the local blacksmith, the local barrel maker, the local printer. Trustees in the 1960s, caught up in the Sputnik scare or frenzy or whatever you want to call it, tried to send what was left of the Franklin legacy to support the creation of graduate nuclear scientists, for example, something Franklin would have had no idea what a nuclear scientist was, but somebody who's highly educated working in a lab, that wouldn't have filled the bill. In another case, there was a proposal, it almost made it, but then there was a change in the trustees to correct what we would see as an error in Franklin's idea, in his legacy. Franklin's loans were to be made only to men. So that was changed later on, and actually it went the other way, where Franklin Fund money went to fund the medical education of women who wanted to go to medical school. Again, two things, I guess, in a way, that would not have been in line with Franklin's ideas. Anyway, and it must be said that over time, some of the decisions made by a succession of volunteer trustees were clearly counter to Franklin's wishes, but they were necessary to preserve the fund and accomplish what was possible. Toward the end of this unique look at Benjamin Franklin's life and legacy, Michael Meyer tells his readers that every generation discovers Benjamin Franklin for themselves. Furthermore, we often mold Franklin's persona into what we would like it to be. In a sense, that's what the volunteer trustees in Boston and Philadelphia did time and again between 1791 and 1994. Like us, that succession of trustees interpreted Franklin's meaning, his stated intentions to their liking, not necessarily to what might have been his liking. In a letter to George Whatley, dated May 23rd, 1785, Franklin wrote, "I have some reason to wish that in a future state, I may not only be as well as I was, but a little better. I shall in some shape or other always exist." By rediscovering Franklin through our reading of Michael Meyer's book about Franklin's last bet, I believe we contribute to the granting of Franklin's expressed wish to George Whatley. Meyer provides a more human, a more admirable, a more unique state for Franklin than he could have imagined. In so doing, Meyer also contributes greatly to our understanding of this founding father, as well as he was, and a little better. You will enjoy reading Michael Meyer's book, Benjamin Franklin's Last Bet. I see someone in the back there has a copy of it. I really think, despite the fact that it deals with legacies and wills and economics, you're going to find this a very entertaining book, and I hope many of you will take the time to read it. With that, thank you. Anybody have any questions?
How much money was left in 1994 for the cities to give to civic improvement?
There were several $100,000. What happened, it happened because there were two funds to be administered separately by different people in Boston and Philadelphia. They went in somewhat different directions. This pin that I'm wearing here celebrates the Benjamin Franklin Memorial and the Franklin Institute in Philadelphia. That's where Philadelphia put their residue of Franklin's money. So if you go to Philadelphia and you visit the Franklin Institute, you'll be able to enjoy his legacy. However, that wasn't possible except for the fact that the Philadelphia trustees also enlisted the aid of Andrew Carnegie. So there's Franklin and Carnegie money in the Franklin Institute. In Boston, they finally decided on establishing what amounted to a technical high school. And it was established in Boston, and it succeeded for a long time, but the demographics of the city of Boston changed, and where that high school was located became a very undesirable part of the city. So in the end, the city of Boston closed the school and demolished it. It doesn't exist. There is still a fund. The proceeds from selling the land and whatever was left went into a fund. It's not Franklin's fund, that's over. His legacy only ran for 200 years. So Boston ostensibly still has some of Franklin's money in some other fund made from liquidating what they originally paid for. Yes?
Did the author give you an idea how much was spent over the 200 years?
Franklin was relying on compound interest. And he calculated that his original bequest to the city of £1,000 after 200 years with all these 5% loans would be worth about £130,000 or about $500,000 in today's money. That's basically, it was by far the main source, or the source of the loans were part of the main part of the cash in the estate of Franklin. He had in his estate, any of you that have dealt with estates know that one of the first things that has to be done is there's an inventory of the estate to find out just what you're dealing with. When Franklin's estate was inventoried, it turned out that there were a lot of people that owed him money. One of whom was his son, William, whom he didn't appreciate. So William's legacy from Franklin is, I forgive your debts, that's it. You know, you had your money, it's over. There were other things that I'm not sure, Meyer doesn't make clear, and I haven't been able to check on it, whether Franklin's trustees were ever able to get the money or not. Franklin, like a number of the founding fathers, had a very strong bent toward voluntary public service. And among other things, he felt that high-ranking public officials, governors, for example, the president, should serve without pay. And he was, for a brief time, the governor of Pennsylvania, and during which time he accepted no pay from the state of Pennsylvania. But in his will, the administrator of his will calculated what the state of Pennsylvania owed him. They had an established salary for the governor. Franklin just refused to accept it. So his heirs, the people that had to process the estate, went back to that and said, oh, by the way, the state of Pennsylvania owes us, you know, several £1,000s for Franklin's service as governor. In kind of, I don't know, deferred compensation, if you want to use a modern term for that. There were debts that people owed to him, mortgages that he held. All sorts of things of that nature that went into it. So I'm not sure I'm answering your question correctly here, but
That's good.
okay.
That's great.
Yeah, when he died, as I think I said it here, the total amount of cash on hand in his estate was £136, maybe $500. And he gave 10 times that each to Philadelphia and to Boston. So that's by far, that's where most of his money went. Yes?
So you had mentioned that everybody has like their own viewpoint of Franklin, and my knowledge is through the Franklin Institute, taking my children to the
Right.
Franklin Institute.
It's a great place.
And so that kind of stole my question, like where the money comes from the Franklin Institute, and you answered it. So my question is there a biography of Franklin that you would recommend? That would
Boy, there are a couple. Most biographies of Franklin actually focus on very specific parts of his life. There's one about his period as a diplomat in France during and right after the American Revolution. course, there's the one book that he wrote that's available is his autobiography. He was very concerned with how his family, his children in particular, would see him in the future. So in, I think it was 1757, he sat down and wrote an autobiography. It's interesting. It's not. It doesn't read like something you get in the New York Times or some other, journalistic endeavor. But it's a real clear view of what his ideas were. And I hesitate to say he was a devious guy, but he makes very clear that he was very conscious about shaping his image. So we have this image of Franklin as being, on one hand, he's the jolly old Quaker, which he wasn't. He was a Baptist. On the other hand, we see him as Dr. Franklin, the eminent scientist. He was very careful to mold an image that would promote not only how people thought about him, but as a diplomat, what he was then be able to do. He was very popular in the court of France. Of course, we all know what happened to Louis XVI. Not so popular in England. Yes?
You spoke about his wife. Did she support how he was presenting himself in the autobiography?
He seems to, in his autobiography, he says some very unkind things about his wife. And he also says some very apologetic things. Well, I was doing a little philandering. I shouldn't have done that. I guess I should go home and apologize. That sort of thing. This son, William, who let him down, was not Deborah's son. He never revealed whose son it was, but not his wife's. So it sort of fits, if you will. And what's one of the other old adages? The acorn doesn't fall far from the tree. Temple, William's son, who was almost as bad as his father, was likewise illegitimate. William never revealed who his mother was, but he did support his father's loyalist leanings. Eventually, both Temple and William end up staying in England after the war. Temple comes back to the United States. He's given this potentially valuable bunch of papers that could have turned a neat fortune for him, even in his own life, about, basically all Franklin's files about who he knew and what was done and where he was and so forth. But he never quite was able to do anything with them, and in fact was probably responsible for losing a fair amount of it. Benjamin Franklin Bache, on the other hand, Franklin took him to Paris with him while he served there as a diplomat. They went out every day and swam the Seine. He had Benny, as he was called, learn French. He had great hopes for Benjamin Franklin Bache. Didn't leave him any cash, but did leave him a thriving business. And then Benjamin Franklin Bache turned around and created this newspaper, got national circulation, the Aurora, and made it a scandal sheet. So when you think of many of the scandals that surfaced in the early years of the Republic about this or that of our founding fathers, Benjamin Franklin Bache is quite often behind those. So, that's there. Again, I'm weaving around the answer a little bit. Did I give you?
Yes, that enough to.
Okay.
Get the
Yes.
What did Franklin leave his sister Jane?
A book. Well, several books. was a framed picture of King Louis of France, but it was bejeweled. The frame had diamonds and other things embedded in it, and according to Meyer's accounting anyway, he's seen the will I have. That was quite valuable. And Franklin had a very strong affinity for his sister. And they were, back and forth on things a great deal. So of the things that he left to people, what he left to his sister was, because of that bejeweled frame, possibly the most valuable of all of them.
Did you have a favorite part of the book? Part three?
Yeah, part three
Part
is,
three?
there are lessons that come out of this that are applicable to a lot of public life today. One of the things that Meyer points out, and others, Meyer's picking up on other people's ideas, is this reliance for such a fund on the existence of volunteer trustees. Franklin just took it for granted that over a period of 200 years, there would be public-spirited men in each of those two cities who would devote their time and their talents to promoting this fund. And some of them took the appointment, but then had distinctly very little interest in doing it. At least one of them was an attorney and ended up representing his heirs who tried to close the fund without success.
Didn't he have other children? You just mentioned.
They all predeceased him.
Oh.
The only ones that were living at the time of his death
He had quite a few,
were,
didn't he?
yeah, not all of whom were Deborah's.
Yeah, I knew that.
Yeah. This is one of the first books really to show Deborah as a very key part of his life, and it's a refreshing look at her. Right from the time that he wrote about her in his autobiography, Deborah Franklin is seen as kind of the little woman who's mostly a joke. But actually, she had a fair amount of money of her own, and she came from a prosperous Philadelphia family. When he went to France to act as a diplomat, he left the management of his business to Deborah. And he wanted to give her a general power of attorney to do that. But in Pennsylvania in the 1770s, it was not legal to give a woman a general power of attorney. So he was able to lobby the Pennsylvania legislature to pass a new law that would allow women, and Deborah Franklin in particular, to be able to exercise a general power of attorney. You have general power of attorney, you have the legal authority to do anything that person that gave it to you would do, just as if you were them. She even was given the latitude to design their new home. While he was overseas, they built a new house, rather lavish house in Philadelphia. Deborah was the general contractor.
So she died before him then, because you didn't mention.
Right.
that she was.
Yeah, she didn't quite make it.
How old was he when he died?
Boy, he was in his 80s. Yep. I can't remember right now the exact year he was born, but he was in his 80s. He had lived a long time.
Pretty good for this.
Yeah. When he drew up his will in the summer of 1788, the United States, as we know it today, didn't really exist. The Constitutional Convention had just met the summer before, and they were, we were in the process of ratifying the Constitution, but the new government under the Constitution, with the president and all of that, would not go into effect until April of 1789. So, one of the reasons that this packet of process of moving from New York to Philadelphia. And, you know, things got sidelined. But, you know, maybe you picked up on the idea that, you know, while the House of Representatives wanted to wear a mourning black armband in honor of Franklin, and the Senate voted it down, you know, so, you know, if you're inclined to hear some news these days
Yeah,
about
sounds
how the
familiar.
Senate does something strange, okay, it's happened before, all the way back to 1791. Those are some of the really interesting sidelines in the book. You know, there's nothing to see today in Boston that's a physical representation of Franklin's legacy. If you go to Philadelphia, there is the Franklin Institute. He didn't pay for all of it, but his legacy paid for a huge chunk of it. And his trustees were the ones who convinced Andrew Carnegie to put his money in it. Carnegie evidenced a great deal of admiration for Franklin. So he felt that what he was doing, Franklin laid the foundation, he was finishing the job.
Did he give anything to the University of Pennsylvania? Or how?
No, as a matter of fact, you know, he in school textbooks, he gets all this credit for being the founder of the University of Pennsylvania. By the time he died, he couldn't stand the University of Pennsylvania. He thought that it had betrayed all of the things that he thought were important. Among other things, is that when Penn was founded, it was basically what I guess you'd call today an honors high school. It turns into a university by the time of the Revolution. Franklin didn't want that. He was very opposed to university education. He was through and through a lot of what he appeared to be. You know, the guy that runs a print shop that, you know, cranks the press and works with the people in his shop to produce the newspapers.
Did the author interpret Plato's Republic and his interpretation of the Guardians? And is there an interpretation of Franklin's view of the Guardians?
He really didn't go into that. Meyer didn't go into that. No. There's a lot of things you could dig into, but you know, you read the book, you're going to be pretty busy with the things that you did. It's really an amazing book. So. Well, thank you all.